Our first Saints Talk of 2026, live from St Andrews. My name's Alex Hayes. I'm Head of Development for Arts and Divinity at the University, and I'm delighted to be introducing today's talk by Struan Watson on modern and contemporary Scottish art at the University of St Andrews. Struan is Assistant Curator of Art and Photography at the University, and he supports the development, management and research of our fine art collection, and in particular the Harry and Marjorie Boswell collection, which is the university's collection of modern and contemporary Scottish art, which was founded in 1995 and continues to be generously supported by the Boswell family. We marked the Boswell collection's 30th anniversary last year with a very fine exhibition of Scottish art at the Wardlaw Museum here, called From These Parts, Scotland, Art and Identity, which was warmly received, but I'm afraid to say has just come to the end of its run. So if you didn't get to see it, it's been and gone. But please do come and visit the Wardlaw and see what we have here year round. Struan holds an MA in the History of Art and an M.Lit in the History of Italian Renaissance Art, both from the University of Glasgow, for which we forgive him. He is a member of and contributor to the Scottish Society for Art History, a member of the British Art Network, and a recipient of the 2024 Art Fund Curators Programme Award at Frieze Masters. And in this talk, he's going to discuss the development of the university's modern and contemporary Scottish art collection, provide some insights into particular artworks, and demonstrate how they can be placed within the broader context of Scottish visual culture. He'll aim to provide a brief overview of Scottish art history from 1900 to the present, while showing the university collection's contribution in recording this history. Struan will speak for about 30 minutes, after which you'll have the opportunity to ask him questions, and I would warmly encourage you to do that. Please do submit your questions in the chat, and you can do that at any point during the talk. Having hosted a number of these talks, I've noticed a pattern where questions can be a little slow to emerge at the start, and then we end up with a deluge with 2 minutes to go. So please don't hold back in submitting your questions into the chat at any time. We will wrap up promptly, no later than 6:15 GMT. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to Struan Watson for his talk, Modern and Contemporary Scottish Art at the University of St Andrews. Struan.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you for the introduction. Yes, and thank you everyone for coming tonight or today, depending on where you're from, to hear me speak on Scottish art. I'm Struan Watson, Assistant Curator of Art and Photography here at the University. And indeed, this is going to be a very brief overview of Scottish art held at the University of St Andrews. But before we start that journey from around the beginning of the 1900s to the modern day, let us briefly consider art and artists in Scotland leading up to the end of the 1800s. In doing so, treat this both as an introduction to the collection of modern and contemporary art and as a prologue. So Scottish art of the 1800s can most broadly be considered as a distancing or a detachment in the relationship between Scotland the place and Scotland its people. The Victorian period of Scottish art would witness a wide range of illustrative and often uncritical depictions of landscapes and ruins and castles, which rendered Scotland as something to observe and perhaps not as a place to live in. This, of course, isn't unique to Scotland. English, French, Dutch and Italian landscapes also have explored the same thing in different ways. In the case of Scotland, this artistic output held its tightest grip. The passive viewership that such artworks entertained saw commercial viability in metropolitan and rapidly urbanising markets, not least in London, to great success, which by the 1860s had consolidated in the visual stereotype of Scotland into land of bens and glens. Here are some examples that can be seen through this uncritical lens. Sam Bow, for example, born in 1822, was an English-born artist who settled in Edinburgh in 1855 and elected Royal Scottish Academician in 1875. He greatly admired the work of J.M.W. Turner, for example, and his dramatic paintings of sea, land, light and vista create captivating and beautiful scenes, albeit at the accentuation of nature. Its emotion is artificially heightened at the expense of realism. Other artists of this period record Scotland through more humble subjects. Particularly popular are scenes of working class men and women, where less concern is placed upon the emotionally sublime, as seen with Sam Bow, and more upon the rustic everyday. Nevertheless, it retains a similar sense of dramatisation in theatre. John McGee was a highly successful painter, landscape and seascape, who favoured fishing scenes in and around Pitt and Weem of Fife, as seen in this painting. And by the time McGee had returned from London, having previously studied in Italy and France, to live and work in Pitt and Weem in 1904, this genre of painting had been well established. Less about individual people, their circumstances, their working lives, and more a concern with the ideal of it all, the rustic and the picturesque, the inoffensive practice of depicting the harsh lives of working people within such delicate terms. While moving away from the emotional sublimity as seen with Sambo, this overt concern with nostalgia and sentiment became an alternative and at times reductive form and perspective of Scotland and its people. Other prominent artists of this period, such as James Guthrie, James Pattison, and John Lavery, would be proponents of this genre of painting, known to many as members of the Glasgow Boys. While not a Glasgow boy himself necessarily, John McGee was a Glasgow student, born in 1867, around 10 years younger than the three I've just named, and can be seen as an extension of that school of painting. If McGee is of the Glasgow style and rustic nostalgia, then Sambo is of an Edinburgh style in the dramatic, sublime landscape and seascape, more closely aligned to that of Peter Graham or John McWhirter, for example. I must caveat by saying that this is but one dimension of Scottish art in the 1800s, which by 1900 had consolidated itself into the visual language of the nation. What has not been mentioned but of equal importance is Celtic Revival art, the arts and crafts movement, and the Art Nouveau, all gaining momentum and popularity by Scottish artists across Britain and Europe more broadly. The point I'm making here is that by 1900, and where we really begin this journey, things began to move very quickly, diverging and splintering into many directions across the arts and literature, just as it was in science and politics. Where Scotland was to find and place itself within this complex network is where the beginning of Scottish modernism can be found. Returning to the examples at hand, due to the easy viewership, the lack of difficult questions, its fiscal viability, and of course popular iconography, Scottish visual culture of the Victorian period is still keenly felt today. I'll end this introduction and prologue by showing this work by Dundee-based artist Alan Ramsay, Wild Music of the Glen, which encapsulates the formulaic processes of depicting Scotland. There's no specificity of place or locality in either its image or in its title. In fact, there are multiple Wild Music of the Glens by various artists held in public collections across Britain. In equal terms, this type of painting was an industry, a market, a genre, and a reliable source of employment for artists, Scottish or otherwise. This formulaic artistic output underpins a seeping sentimentality and at times a nauseating nostalgia which required radical thinking by radical individuals to dismantle. Scottish art in the 1900s was to witness a massive output of energy, a coiled up spring released in the expression of a modern Scotland into a new modern world. Formed in the early 1900s, the combined efforts of artists, poets, writers, alongside patrons, publishers, collectors and activists, were moving Scottish culture into a new direction, sometimes looking back, but always moving forward. It was the poets and the writers who led this charge. The Scottish literary renaissance, as it came to be known, had its chief figure in Christopher Grieve, otherwise known as Hugh MacDiarmid, who utilised the Scots language to great effect. Likewise, other poets such as Sorla MacLean and Norman MacCaig, writing in Gaelic and in English respectively, would closely follow MacDiarmid in presenting Scotland within the international community of nations. Novelist and translator Willa Muir is another significant figure in Scottish literary modernism. She graduated from the University of St Andrews as one of the first Scottish women to attend university. In fact, artists may well have been the least involved in this Scottish modernist movement in its infancy, and so a small yet significant number of rather disparate Scottish artists arose. Scottish art historian Tom Normand identifies the three main figures as William McCance, William Johnston, and John Duncan Ferguson. For John Duncan Ferguson and William McCance specifically, it was their rejection of the sentimental and romantic visions of Scotland where their modernism comes forth. Their methods in achieving this, however, very quickly diverge. For John Duncan Ferguson to move forward, it was to take inspiration further back in time. His alignment to the values of Celtic revivalism, its rhythmic decorative art, and its associated mythology were sharply met with his involvement in and influences from European modernist painting, not least in the influence of avant-garde styles such as Fauvism, Post-Impressionism and Cubism. A combination of his proud Scottish and particularly Gaelic heritage with a European and international outlook was to be realised in a significant move from Scotland to live and work in Paris in 1907. For Ferguson, the shared Celtic heritage between Scotland and France was key in the expression of a cultural alliance between the two countries. This shared cultural connection in Scotland's history was to provide the catalyst in Ferguson's argument that Scotland was a modernist European nation in the present. France, he wrote, allowed him to be Scottish. He briefly returned to Britain during the First World War, but returned to France in 1918. This sketch from 1919 shows one of Ferguson's many trips to the south of France, where he worked and holidayed. A still life and view of mountains from the town of Cassis show a clear influence from the still lives of, for example, Paul Cézanne. Indeed, around 20 miles away from Cassis and around 20 years prior, Cézanne was painting one of his many renditions of Mont Saint-Victoire. As a Scottish artist travelling to work in France, Ferguson was not alone. In fact, by the early 1900s, it had become custom for Scottish artists to study in Paris. The difference being here that Ferguson, more so than any other of his Scottish or indeed British contemporaries, was keyed into the cultural and artistic discourses of the day, enveloped into close-knit circles of radical individuals who came to Paris from anywhere between North America to Russia, a melting pot of artists, writers, performers and academics who have come to the avant-garde modernist capital of Europe. Ferguson, more so than any other artist from Britain, was at its centre. Most notably, Pablo Picasso was a friend of Ferguson's. It was Picasso who, in 1939, encouraged Ferguson to return to Scotland and take his radical modernist work back to new Scottish audiences. Samuel John Peploe was an Edinburgh-born artist like Ferguson, and 3 years his elder. He would follow in Ferguson's footsteps by moving to France in 1910, staying there till 1912. Together, John Duncan Ferguson, Samuel John Peploe, as well as two Scottish artists, George Leslie Hunter and Francis Campbell Boileau-Cadell, would later become known as the Scottish Colourists, perhaps the most important group of Scottish painters in the 1900s. Their chief concerns with line, form, rhythm, shape and of course colour placed Scottish art within the modernist paradigm of European culture. The four exhibited together as a quartet on only 3 occasions during their lifetime, twice in Paris and once in London, most notably no times in Scotland. If Ferguson looks to a prehistoric Celtic past to understand Scotland's place in the present, then William McCance, equally fervent in his Scottish nationalist identity, looked to the future. McCance's modernist outlook was not found in the cafes of Paris, nor in the exuberant social circles of bohemian proportions. Rather, his outlook was that of mechanisation, industry, a man-made future equipped with the tools required for the machine age. Glasgow trained, he and his first wife, Agnes Miller Parker, who was also an artist, aligned closely to the Vorticist and Cubist movements. McCance would most clearly develop these styles when he and Agnes moved to live and work in London in 1920. Though the subject's identity is not fully known, this sketch here, woman seated at an easel, may well be Agnes Miller Parker herself working away at an artwork. The movement of the head, the tapping of the feet, the dynamic and changing poses together arrested in time onto one page. This offers a useful insight into the specific view of modernism at the time. Not only are artists viewing the world in radical new ways, they also become the subjects of these radical viewpoints. It transformed how artists viewed the world just as much as the world was transforming them. It is important to note that McCance was imprisoned in 1917 as a conscientious objector during the war. His political and artistic outlook is aligned to that of the previously mentioned Hugh MacDiarmid. MacDiarmid admired the work of McCance and Miller Parker, seeing their work as tools in the early formation of a Scottish nationalist identity. The constructed self in a nation of industry and machine marching forwards into a self-determined future. However, for McCance specifically, and to an extent MacDiarmid himself, this risked personal alienation. When McCance moved to London in 1920, he would not return to Scotland until 1963. Perhaps Scotland was a nation not prepared, not equipped for such modernist change. It's worth noting that Scotland in the early 20th century, and Edinburgh specifically, was a heartland of lawyers and doctors and academics and ministers, a land of John Knox and Jean Calvin. Such radicalism espoused by McCance would find difficulty breaching this Presbyterian fortress. McCance was rendered peripheral to Scotland. Likewise, John Duncan Ferguson, as mentioned, was permanently settled outside of Scotland, living between Paris and London. Both artists are engaging with broader cultural and artistic influences beyond Scotland at this time, relevant to Scotland, but absolutely European and international. In good time, they would eventually return. St Andrews plays a small but significant role in the visibility of Scottish modern art of this period. American-born James Huntington White moved to St Andrews in 1930. He was founder and editor of The Modern Scot, a magazine which argued in favour of Scottish modernism, nationalism and independence on topics ranging art and politics. An art gallery was set up by White on North Street in St Andrews. That's the same North Street where the offices of many of my university colleagues and myself are based today. It was from this gallery where he exhibited works by the Scottish colourists, and most favourably that of Samuel John Peploe, who we've just seen. White was also in regular contact with McCance, urging him to come back to Scotland during this period of what I will describe as modernist exile. Addressed to McCance, or Mac as he was colloquially known, in 1931, James White urges Mac to come to St Andrews to do summer classes for his students. After all, St Andrews, quote, after all, St Andrews is Scotland's oldest university and has damned little to show for itself, except the ruins. You could get more foreign students to go here, if only for the summer courses. It would be a great triumph. James White consistently championed Scottish art. Moreover, the success of his Modern Scot magazine places St Andrews, as argued by Professor Robin Crawford, as one of the centres of avant-garde activity, modernist activity in Scotland during this period. McCance never took up the invite to come to St Andrews. He remained south of the border until 1963. That's 43 years living and working outside of Scotland. Meanwhile, in the 1920s, a new generation of Scottish artists were emerging back home. William Gillis and Anne Redpath are of a generation younger than McCance and Ferguson. This period of the early 1900s saw the transformation of the Trustees' Academy, at which Ferguson was briefly a student, into the Edinburgh College of Art. Gillis and Redpath were at the college at the same time and would have worked together in the same studios during their time as students. Gillis was drafted into service during the First World War and upon his return graduated and continued on to teach at the college. Gillis and Redpath were standout artists at Edinburgh, and they were invited to attend workshops in Paris, as was the custom for Scottish artists to travel to Paris. A visit to the studio of the great avant-garde cubist painter André Lotte was put in place in 1923. Gillis took up the invite, and upon his return briefly explored the cubist abstract experiment, but quickly moved on to explore alternative approaches to painting. Anne Redpath, on the other hand, didn't even take up the invite. Both these artists are absorbing on the one hand and rejecting on the other styles, movements and types of schooling, which would otherwise risk pigeonholing their artistic development. Likewise, their concerns were never truly modern or international by strict definition. A greater concern was placed upon individual expression. Cast your mind back to the Scottish Renaissance of Hugh MacDiarmid described earlier, or of William McCance's alignment to it. Here is what William Gillis had to say. There was no awareness of any Scottish Renaissance. We were all too much taken in painting pictures as good as we could make them, to bother overmuch about wider issues. There was no common aim. Each was regarded as an individual. There could be no manifests. It was just a body of enthusiastic painters. For Gillis, true freedom in the expression of form and colour would define his career. The style, contours or lines that these forms took were unpredictable and totally unique to him. The same can be said of Redpath. Most influential upon Gillis specifically was a 1931 exhibition held in Edinburgh of the work of Edvard Munch. It was in Munch's fluidity of expression where Gillis was able to move away from the strict rhetoric of Cubism. He felt most comfortable painting subjects familiar to him. In all, this meant painting Scotland, very much home to him, from Edinburgh and its environs to the borders to the Highlands and Islands. Gillis carries with him, however, service in the First World War and the trauma that it brought forth, not only of comrades but of the family members closer to home. His sister died prematurely, aged 36, which left deep marks, and he never spoke of his time in war. Think of McCance, who objected to fighting, or of John Duncan Ferguson, who did everything he could to avoid being sent to France. As Ferguson's partner at the time, Margaret Morris, recalls, he didn't want to join the army because he didn't like the khaki colour of the uniform. In any case, neither artist, though perhaps able to fight, didn't. To an extent, their concerns were channeled into wider artistic developments on a European scale, not carrying the weight of the individual trauma that Gillis was certainly exposed to. Redpath took breaks in her artistic career to raise 3 children. Unlike Gillis, she would live and work in France, Italy and Spain, often painting her recollections of Scotland at a distance. Likewise, when she was living in Edinburgh, she would cast her mind southwards and paint images of the Mediterranean at a similar distance. What we see is a quick change in the artistic expressions from Scottish artists from one generation to the next. One in the collective nationalist cause for artistic and political independence, the other in the protection and sanctity of artistic individuality, opposed to manifestos and styles. The First World War may well have been the chief proponent in that transition. Its conclusion in 1918 calls to light the sheer human waste and futility of it all. Mere yards and metres fought for land at the expense of hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides. For Gillis, such collective causes only saw destruction and death, with nothing to show for it. Self-expression and development, as well as self-preservation, were perhaps areas to better place one's values. On the topic of preservation, let us return to the work of Samuel John Peploe, like Ferguson, a member of the Scottish Colourists. This work by Peploe is of the Fife town of Ceres, and is part of a broader series of works called the Recording Scotland Collection. Commissioned by the Pilgrim Trust during the Second World War, selected artists painted this nation's towns, villages, street markets and rural areas as visual records and timeless relics, in the event of possible invasion, bombing and destruction. This was an opportunity for artists to undertake some work during the war, and significant artists such as Kate Cameron and her brother David Young Cameron, Anne Spence Black and Charles Oppenheimer all featured in the collection. This work by Peploe, for example, was purchased rather than commissioned and acquired into the collection as an addition. This collection of 145 artworks was donated by the Pilgrim Trust to the University of St Andrews in 1953, where it is still held today. One of the Pilgrim Trust's founding trustees was Sir James Irvine, principal of the University of St Andrews from 1921 until his death in 1952. The donation of this collection to the university commemorates Principal Irvine's legacy. Art in Scotland after the Second World War carries new challenges for a new generation of artists. Questions of Scottish nationalism, identity and cultural independence were, for the most part, replaced by a strongly consolidated notion of a British identity, forged in a common cause against the Axis powers. After the war, however, the economy was crippled and rationing remained in place until 1954. At the same time, there were rapid advancements in technology and scientific innovation. Art and creativity were forms of escapism from the difficult realities of life, embracing these scientific and often fictional visions of the future. A significant number of artists moved away from Scotland in the post-war period, and a diaspora was occurring, and crises in Scottish identity ensued, engendered by post-war politics and peripheral suppression, reflected in the lack of funding, patronage and support for the arts in Scotland. Edoardo Palozzi is a key figure in the new expression of art in this post-war age. Born in Leith to Italian parents, Palozzi drew upon his early fascination with comic books, toys and magazines, as advertising, pop culture and mass-produced materials became sources of artistic inspiration and development. The high academic aesthetic standards of painting and sculpture made way for everyday pulp, newspapers, magazines and ready-mades. Items that were cheap to buy and had low material value, Palozzi would demonstrate that its cultural and artistic value was much greater. By 1970, he had been appointed commander of the British Empire. He had worked in Paris, London and California, and had spent much time teaching and working in Germany. He was an internationally recognised artist, and the volume of work in print, collage and sculpture he produced was vast. In early 1971, the University of St Andrews was initially presented with the idea of holding an archive of his work. There were, however, as expected, a few formal hoops to jump through before the Palozzi archive made its way to St Andrews. One of these hoops was that of the name of the archive. The original name given to the collection by the artist in true Palozzi fashion was the Crazy Cat Archive. However, the university's response was less than eager. Quote, "The project will be much more likely, in my opinion, to go smoothly through university court if we could drop this title. If you prefer to leave things as they are, no doubt there'll be an interesting exchange of remarks at the court, but I'm not so gloomy as to suppose that the whole thing would be jeopardised." This was addressed by then Vice Principal of the University, Lionel Butler, to Professor John Steer of the Department of Fine Arts. This is before it turned into the Department of Art History, the School of Art History, excuse me. It was John Steer who, writing on behalf of Palozzi, replied, "Palozzi has now approved the title of the Crazy Cat Archive to be Edoardo Palozzi Donation Archive Material for 20th Century Art." It really just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? This shift from a fun, poppy title into a very dry corporate one, to me, is an ironic dig and a criticism. an extension of Palozzi's distaste towards rules, formality, and perhaps bureaucracy. This would be the first of a few sources of discontent for Palozzi in holding his archive here. By 1985, the archive was acquired by the V&A, where it is still held today. Nevertheless, Palozzi's relationship to the university remained strong right up to his death in 2005. He was awarded an honorary doctorate by the university in 1995, and in 2024, the university acquired over 250 prints and sculptures through the bequest of Robin Spencer, a colleague of the aforementioned John Steer, who was a Palozzi scholar himself. Many of these artworks were addressed both for Robin and for the University of St Andrews, written by Palozzi himself, as you can see in this image here. Palozzi is today the most represented artist in the university's entire art collection by number of artworks. Represented in the art collection, Palozzi can be placed along other Scottish artists who achieved international success outside of their country of origin, not least in the work of abstract artists Alan Davey and William Geer. Geer most notably was born here in Fife. Both Geer and Davey exhibited alongside the abstract expressionist artist Jackson Pollock in New York in 1949 and 1950, respectively. As you can see here, William Geer, upon receiving the news that he was to be exhibited alongside Jackson Pollock, was, quote, not exactly thrilled at the prospect, going by art historian Andrew Lamberth's assessment. The impact Scottish artists were making out of Scotland was nevertheless pronounced, particularly in London, yet less so perhaps on the local domestic scene closer to home. The pop art of Palozzi and the abstract art of Davey and Geer, developed in the 1950s, were responses to the disillusionment and dejection towards the numbing realities of post-war Scotland and its place in what had become the postmodern world. But out of this obscure nebula, Scotland was in a problematic place, lacking a clear identity which favoured a very small number of highly successful artists, but drew focus away from the majority of artists living and working and often struggling in Scotland. By the mid-1970s, artistic responses in the desire to consolidate Scottish art and identity were underway. With a clear and distinctive figurative style, as opposed to abstraction or pop, artists approached realism and a grounded approach to painting. One of its most important advocates was the artist Alexander Moffat. The Rock, the Radical Road, from between 1988 to 89, calls attention to the struggle for unemployed Scots who fought and died for their right to work. It was these same men who built the road up the side of this dangerous rock known as the Salisbury Crags. Moffat chose not to cast his gaze over Edinburgh Castle and instead adjusted his focus. He settled on the topography which looms over the city and also lies in the very heart of that city. These landscapes are rendered monuments of social history and struggle, laced with iconographic meaning. This popular tourist destination that can lead up to the summit of Arthur's Seat found nearby. Moffat nevertheless reminds us that at this summit, it is not Edinburgh that provides the view. It's provided by the self-determination of the Scottish people who built the road. Moffat will lead a new generation of artists back into figurative painting, painting with meaning, figure, and representation, precipitated with a reassertion of national characteristics in Scottish art. For Moffat, and for many of his students, this would be achieved by examining Scotland through social and political lenses. Artists such as Ken Currie, one of Moffat's students, would eventually lead this new period of Scottish art. Indeed, out of the Glasgow School, Currie became one of the 4 members of a group of artists called the New Glasgow Boys, emerging in the 1980s. Currie examines the difficulties faced in Scotland in light of lack of public funding into education and healthcare, with this stark and visceral work, The Age of Uncertainty. It's typical of his style, and we've long since departed from the fishing nets of Pit and Weem. Currie takes his viewer into the symbolic and foreboding, but nevertheless leaves little to the imagination. Social change and artistic expression reach another apex in the work of Maud Sulter. Her work is integral to the Black Arts movement in Britain in the 1980s and 90s. This work, titled C'est Moi, is part of a wider photographic series of 9 large-scale artworks titled Significant Others, all held at the university. Sulter took the small handheld photographs from her childhood and small enough to fold into your pocket, and expanded them into these massive photographic reproductions which take up entire wall spaces. These expansions literally foreground and call attention to Black artists, not least Maud Sulter herself, who have historically been overlooked. Sulter presents her childhood photographs afresh, placing herself at the centre of her audience's vision. Born in Glasgow to a Scottish mother and to a Ghanaian father, Sulter explores notions of dual nationality and identity. While Sandy Moffat, on the one hand, reduces castles and geological formations into a few brushstrokes, Maud Sulter, on the other, expands her presence as a black artist to fill entire gallery spaces. Foreground and background have swapped positions as Scottish artists of this period shine light on the unexplored social and political realities of the nation. Not romantically looking back, nor destructively looking forward, they're simply responding to the circumstances that they find themselves in. By 1995, Scottish art was in a very real and thinkable place. Major texts and books had been published solely on Scottish art, retrospective exhibitions of Scottish artists at their national institutions, and a flourishing cohort of art schools and art graduates across the country. In Scotland, it had the support academically and publicly as an independent discipline, distinct to, yet shoulder to shoulder with, its European neighbours. The University of St Andrews actively contributes to this support. Since 1995, the university has been custodian to the Harry and Marjorie Boswell Art Collection, a significant collection of modern and contemporary Scottish art. In its formation in 1995, it was a collection that comprised 10 prints. Today, it is a collection which boasts over 180 artworks across print, oil, sculpture, text, drawing, and film. With yearly purchases, several commissions, and with the support of donations and gifts, this collection has become an important and relevant repository which showcases the best in Scottish art from around 1900 to the modern day. Actively used in research, teaching, and exhibitions locally and nationwide, this collection can also be found across our university campus, on display at the Wardlaw Museum, the main venue in the display of the university collections, and on the walls of schools and departments in St Andrews for our students, visitors, and staff to enjoy and celebrate. This celebration culminated, as Alex has mentioned, in the 30th anniversary of the collection in 2025, with an exhibition of selected artworks which were on display at the Wardlaw Museum. One of the most recent acquisitions into the collection was a body of work by Zimbabwean Scottish artist Sekai Machache. The significant acquisition across print, sculpture and film will be on display at the Wardlaw Museum in St Andrews from October of 2026 until spring of 2027. I will finish with the aerial photography of Patricia MacDonald, another work from the Boswell collection. Notice the point of departure made from landscape scenes a century before. No longer must we see these landscapes in romance or myth, such as the wild music of the Glen. We can now see these landscapes with absolute clarity and freshly see Scotland in new and dynamic ways through the creativity and ingenuity of its artists. This clarity is reflected in the artwork's title, Loch na Waina, the green lochen below the Angel's Peak of Carnanshavel, Cairngorms. It is utterly specific. I can clearly locate it and I can find it. In contrast, Wild Music of the Glen is a title which was used to obscure Scotland from its viewer. In this image, Scotland is not meant to be found, only to be contemplated. Contemporary artists in Scotland have truly located this nation as a visible and thinkable place. Over time and moving forward, Scottish artists will continue to change how this nation is made visible in light of emerging artistic and academic disciplines, the climate emergency, and improvements in accessibility, which will redefine and change the meaning of Scottish art. As such, I hope, in this very brief tour of Scottish art held at the University of St Andrews, that I've been able to call attention to the idea that Scottish art will never truly be Scottish, but rather in a constant state of becoming Scottish. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to that, as I say, very brief tour of our collection, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I'd like to also note that everything you've seen in that presentation is part of our collection, and we've got a few links to share to our digitised online collection catalogue of that, as well as the Boswell collection websites, which you can follow in the chat. Those will be up momentarily, and I'll pass you back over to Alex. Thank you, Alex.
Struan, thank you very much for that erudite and whistle-stop tour of Scottish art from we started in the mid 19th century, didn't we, to up to right up to the present day. It's great, great stuff. I was particularly amused by the Lionel Butler quote, which was probably not the most important part of your presentation, but Lionel Butler is one of those names that continues to have a great resonance for those St Andrews students who were here while he was a professor here, and indeed I'm in touch with his daughter as well, who I think will be very entertained to hear that quote about Paolozzi. Um, uh, you mentioned the sort of the effect in the I think we were in about the 1970s of a few very successful artists really sort of soaking up all the attention amongst in the Scottish art scene at the time. I mean, that's something that sort of happens all the time, isn't it? I mean, was there something particular going on at that point that in the sort of 70s, 80s maybe, that was really polarizing that attention and the resources of the art world here, or was it just a reflection of a broader kind of syndrome?
I think since for a very long time Scotland has struggled with patronage, it seems to be a difficult thing that's happened, not endemic to the 1970s. Scottish artists, since after the war, where there was a major move from the Edinburgh schools and Glasgow schools down to London. That's where the jobs were, that's where the patronage was. And to stay in Scotland was seen as a step backward in your artistic development. Um, there's kind of two main reasons from a very broad kind of historical background. The first being in St Andrews, the Reformation. That's the first period of art in ecclesiastical context being taken away and stripped away. The second being James I and VI moving his court down to London in the early 17th century. That has actually, for many people, that is still felt today. That removal of art patronage is still felt. So after things like the Napoleonic Wars, massive downturn in artistic development in Scotland. It had to be rejuvenated by Sir Walter Scott. After the Second World War, massive loss of cultural development, almost stagnated. And so there's already very few artists. The main artists for me after the war that particularly notable who were successful and stayed in Scotland. The main one of that is Joan Earley. She's a very who doesn't feature in our collection, but is one of the most prominent examples. And why they're so celebrated is that it's so against it goes against the grain. So artists like Alan Davey and William Gear, they're not actually really that too well known in Scotland, but they're absolutely well known in France and in London. And they tried their luck in America. They weren't so successful in America, but certainly in fact, William Gear is not even seen as a Scottish artist. He's seen as a Parisian artist. He's seen as a student of the École, I think École des Beaux-Arts, École de Paris, yeah, one of those, as a more of a kind of French school, which is interesting. Yeah, it's I think there's an historical precedent that's for in the broader context that Scottish art has been slowly stripped back in terms of patronage, but then there's these small blips where it means that when an artist like Sandy Moffat comes along, they're just so important in reconsolidating national characteristics in Scottish art, but in such soft and delicate ways. They're not going about into the Highlands with a kilt on and a saltire. They're doing it in ways that actually have really important social political meaning. And they're approachable and thinkable works of art. They're not abstract. They're not Pollock drip paintings, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's fascinating. So here's a good challenging question for you to kick off. I don't have the question's name, but I know that this is an area that you've been working on, particularly in relation to the Boswell collection. The questioner says, "Thank you for this interesting talk and informative contextualization. I really loved all the connections that you drew between the history of art and the history of the university. I'm wondering, though, where are the women? They're in the paintings, mainly in domestic scenes, but where are the Scottish women artists?" I know you've just mentioned one, but I know you mentioned some of them briefly, Kate Cameron and Black, but they were somehow on the sideline, I felt. Why?
Women weren't admitted into art schools for the most part. Not at least until you're thinking the institutionalization of the Glasgow School of Art by Fry Newbery in the late 19th century. there are other things in place. For example, the marriage bar, the Scottish marriage bar. If women were to marry into a family of artists, they were forced to give up their jobs as professional artists. They could still do it on the side, but they weren't able to make money from it. So there's many prominent artists who had to give up their career. Absolutely vital and important. Very talented artists such as Dorothy Johnson, who married D.M. Sutherland, who had to give up their jobs as teachers in art schools. And those kind of laws, that specific law was in place until 1977, for example. So it's well within living memory, well within living memory.
And I think it's also true to say, and you know, in a survey like this in half an hour, it's impossible to mention everyone. But when you think about, in particular, the recent residencies and commissions that the Boswell collection has been involved with, I think they're almost all female artists. So Sekai Machache, you mentioned, but also Alberta Whittle, Alana Halperin,
Rachel Adams as well.
Yeah, and then the Maud Sulter acquisition as well a few years back. So I think it's, tell me if I'm stepping out of line here, I think it's probably fair to say that female representation in the collections is continues to be a work in progress, but certainly recent commissions and acquisitions are, I think, going quite a long way to redressing that.
Yeah, I think the historical, more modern art period, it's absolutely male dominated, and that is a reflection of the systemic rules at the time. Artists like Joe Nearly, going back to Joe Nearly, the war was actually quite an interesting period where it opened up opportunities for more women to go into art schools, not least Joe and into Glasgow School of Art. So historically, there are pockets where you can see that activity happening, but more so, it's more accessible for us. It's more available from a contemporary point of view to encourage, to commission, and to actively acquire works by women artists. In fact, I think after any artworks made after 2000, we are absolutely a female-dominated collection. It's more in 1980 and earlier. It's really very much the other way around. Yeah.
So some more good questions coming in. So first one that I'm just going to put your way is, I was expecting that you might have mentioned C.R. Mackintosh as an artist in his later years, and the two Roberts, both of whom are Scottish artists who are very much connected with European artistic movements in their time. Is this because they aren't represented in the St Andrews collection?
It's simply put, yes. It's not. It's because they are not in the collection. I will caveat by saying not yet. Hopefully, one day, who knows? The two Roberts is a very interesting one. Of course, there's been a lot of interest and research been put out on those two artists. And Charles Vinnie Mackintosh would be an excellent example of, just a testament to the limited time, but I had afforded to me for the talk. But that's a great example of an artist not unlike John Duncan Ferguson, absolutely engaging with European visual culture. In fact, he was perhaps for a time more celebrated outside of Scotland than in it. He and his partner were nothing short of a king and a queen when they arrived in Vienna for the Vienna secessionists. When they moved there for a time. So yeah, absolutely, that's a great example of another Scottish artist making an impact on within European international modernism in the same way that John Duncan Ferguson is, in very different ways again. I think that for the purpose of the talk, it was just more, these are in our collection, and we can point into the collection and how that can point back out into how they feed into the broader visual culture within Europe in the modern period. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. So I'll just read this not a question, but some nice memories here. So I remember Professor Butler well, and also studied in the second year that art history was offered at St Andrews. So knew John Steer and Robin Spencer as well. Only a one-year course then, from ancient Greece to Picasso at something of a gallop, but punched well above its weight and resulted in my eventually completing an art history degree many years later. I also had the pleasure of meeting William Gere when he lived in Birmingham. He still had his distinctive Scottish accent, notwithstanding the Parisian connection. So that was I'm unable to credit that to our correspondent, who's coming as anonymous poster, but very nice memories there. So here's another good challenge to you. What about the local artist Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham? Good question.
Yes, yeah, we've got Wilhelmina in the collection. Great, and that's an absolute glaring omission from my presentation. That's absolutely completely valid, and also the work of Beatrice Huntington. We have two works by Beatrice in the collection as well. I think the works by Beatrice are not quite, they don't quite, as portrait and as commissioned portraits, they don't quite feed into the modernist contemporary argument, and perhaps not as within the broader context of Scottish art that I'm trying to talk about here. Not to say that her work doesn't. The ones that we have in our collection perhaps just don't speak to it as well as other ones that I've mentioned. And Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham could have featured her work in here as well. There's I think interesting upcoming exhibitions on Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham. What's really interesting about her previous exhibitions is most of her work is focused on the St. Ives period and the Cornwall period, and one of her major exhibitions most recently didn't feature any works from her time in Orkney, or indeed any works featured of work made in Scotland. So Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham has this kind of dual artistic identity, where you've got this St. Ives school, where she's working away, and exhibitions on that, but it doesn't really tap into the Scottish art and particularly Orcadian art that she's exploring as well. So that's an interesting one, definitely, and one I very much could have explored in the talk.
But you can't do everything in half an hour. So just, I'm not seeing any more questions coming in from correspondence just at the moment. So if you do have any more, please fire them in shortly. I just had one or two other things I wanted to ask you about. We don't have an associated art school here at St Andrews, and that is certainly a different situation to the other three ancients, and also, of course, Dundee, just over the bridge. Does that create some challenges from a collecting point of view? Are there any advantages from not having an art school? What are your thoughts on that?
I think definitely both challenges and advantages. The challenges being that we don't have that nexus of a creative artistic output happening all the time in St Andrews, but we do have prominent names that come up within. When you think of St Andrews, we think of course, Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham, but it doesn't have that continuous output at the same level, the same degree as the other universities, and so that can peripheralize St Andrews to a certain extent, and it decenters as one of the artistic monopolies. On the other, it means from a collecting point of view, our scope in our collecting is much more broad. We don't feel we are parochial. We don't feel like we need to just acquire artworks from St Andrews, or we don't feel a necessary bias towards, not that we don't support local artists, and of course we do, with many artists living in Fife, working in Fife, who we acquire. But it means that we don't feel, if we want to get an artwork from an artist who's graduated in Dundee, working in Glasgow, but has made a series in the Highlands, Sekai Machache, for example, we can do that. And there's no blocking us from doing that at all. There's no step-by-step process saying, oh, actually, where's that proper St Andrews connection? If it's relevant to our audiences, if it's relevant to our exhibition programming, if it's relevant to the strategies and upholding the objectives that we want to make for our teaching, our research, our exhibitions, that kind of thing, then we will go for it. And so our net can be cast quite wide. So we've got artworks from printmakers in Aberdeen. We get stuff artworks commissioned through Dundee Contemporary Arts. We're of course up and down to Edinburgh quite often, and indeed working with commissioned artists in Glasgow, most recently, not least, Sekai and Rachel Adams. So it's a coverage thing. We don't feel too tied down, which is a great thing, definitely. Very much more of an advantage than a disadvantage.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. So, question here from Adam Scott. Do we have paintings and drawings from those who taught and studied anatomy and botany at the university?
We do indeed. We've got anatomical drawings, and they're on display at the Wardlaw Museum. Those, however, I don't think, to the best of my knowledge, are part of the art collection per se. I think they're part of the AP collection, the Anatomy and Pathology collection. I'm happy to be corrected on that. But yes, absolutely we do. Yeah. And in fact, I was told that there's an interest, they're on display and they're framed and mounted, but you can still see the pinholes where they were attached to the cadavers. But I won't go into too much detail on that, particularly around tea time for many of us.
Thank you. Another quick one from me, and it sort of relates to what we were talking about before with the situation with an art school attached or not. Can you talk a little bit more about how the collection is used across our public engagement and programming at the university? So obviously we have permanent exhibitions. And then we have temporary exhibitions like from these parts that we've just had, and it's great to be able to do those now at the Wardlaw. But more broadly, how do people kind of get the chance to engage with the work that we hold here?
Yeah, so we have a limited collection, first and foremost. So it means that there's only so many places we can have an artwork at any one time. That being said, we have a very important digitization service, and so if people want artworks for offices or hallways, we can provide prints and reproductions of those to be displayed around campus. Likewise, we do small rotation of artworks outside of exhibitions. So on permanent display at the Wardlaw Museum, we do rotating artworks, for example, the Recording Scotland collection, where we've been trying to get more women artist representation out there and find more balance in getting those names made public and their artworks, of course, made public. In terms of the art collection's public engagement, we've been trying to, or at least I've been trying to get the art collection into exhibitions which are not art related. And so, for example, we had an exhibition on alien worlds and exoplanets. And for that, we brought in a print by Alberta Whittle. And so we're trying to find these very interesting connections that intersect different disciplines and different topics, and to engage in subjects from different angles. And so it's making sure that our audiences, regardless of their level of education or age or background, they can come into an exhibition and they can find ways of understanding the topic from as many angles as possible. So that's been a very rewarding experience, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But aside from that, we also have artworks that are site specific. So we've got the work of, for example, Doug Cocker in the Laidlaw Music Centre, which has been very popular and very successful. And that's something we're hoping to explore more in the future as well, and something to keep in mind for any potential new acquisitions coming into the collection as well.
Yeah, great. Well, look, I think we'll wrap up there. And thank you so much for both the presentation and your engagement with the questions afterwards. I would like to warmly invite everyone to join us for the next Saints Talk, which will be on the 24th of March with Professor Tom Kelsey from our School of Computer Science. Tom's specialist area is in the use of AI in women's health and fertility, and in analysing the effects of childhood cancer. So possibly a slightly tougher listen than this evening's very enjoyable romp through Scottish art history, but important and fascinating work. And so we very much hope that you'll join us on the 24th of March for that. But for now, many thanks again to you, Struan, for your talk today. It's been hugely enjoyable and extremely informative. And to all of you who've been watching for joining us. From us here in St Andrews, have a very good evening. Bye-bye.